I came into this world at a time that could be called the worst possible. My parents' marriage was already hanging by a thread, and my arrival didn't do much to help. My name is Tiffany, and my father, Tom, was far from thrilled when my mother told him she was pregnant. "You planned this, didn't you, Lisa?" he yelled during one of their fights. "You got pregnant on purpose to trap me here." Those words echoed in my mind. I'd heard this story from my mother so many times that I could almost see the scene playing out before my eyes, even though I was too young to remember it. My mother said my father was too carefree, too irresponsible to be a proper family man. His paycheck disappeared on cigarettes, motorcycles, music, anything but us. Their arguments echoed through our small house for 4 long years. Sometimes they fought about money, sometimes about his late nights out, and sometimes about me. Their shouting was the backdrop of my childhood. When I turned 5, they finally divorced. My father vanished, as if he had never existed. No letters, no phone number, no child support. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air, leaving only my mother's bitterness behind. "A real man doesn't abandon his child," she repeated, her voice sharp with anger. I remember how her eyes hardened like stone every time his name was mentioned. At some point, I learned not to ask questions about him. The only thread connecting me to my father's side of the family was my grandmother Eleanor. There was an invisible chasm between her and my mother. Grandmother blamed Mom for the failure of their marriage. "You drove him away with your nagging, your constant complaints," she said with icy disdain. In response, Mom couldn't stand even the sound of her voice. When it was time for my visits to Grandma's, Mom would silently drop me off at her doorstep, turn around, and leave without a word. But the moment I crossed into Grandma's house, I felt completely different. Eleanor hugged me so warmly that it felt like, for a moment, I was in a different world. She stroked my hair and told me stories about my father when he was young. Her smile was calm, her voice soft. "You look just like him, sweetheart," she'd say, running her finger gently down my cheek. "You have his eyes, his smile, even that little dimple when you laugh." With each visit, I absorbed these stories like a dry sponge. Grandma's house, smelling of cookies and lavender, became my refuge. There were no loud arguments, no heavy looks from my mother. There, it was warm. 3 years passed like this. By the time I turned 8, I had grown accustomed to this double life: weekdays with my mother, who never stopped being angry at my father, and weekends with my grandmother, who seemed to still hope he would one day return. This balance was shattered on a rainy Tuesday in October. Mom got a call. I remember how her face went pale and her eyes darkened. She stood silently with the receiver in her hand while someone spoke on the other end. When the call ended, she took a deep breath and looked at me. "Get your coat, Tiffany," she said, her voice trembling. "Grandma Eleanor wants to see both of us. It's important." I nodded, though I didn't understand why Mom looked so tense. She spoke calmly, but her hands fidgeted with a button on her coat. We stepped out into the rain, the drops tapping against the umbrella as we walked to the car. Her silence filled the space between us, and I could sense something hanging in the air, something big that I couldn't yet grasp. The drive to Grandma's house felt different. Usually, Mom just dropped me off at the door and drove away, but today she parked the car and walked with me to the door. It was unusual, and something about her silent focus made me nervous. The heavy quiet between us wasn't broken by a single word or even the familiar hum of the radio, which Mom usually turned on to fill the void. We reached the door, and Mom knocked, even though she always used to just walk in. The door slowly opened, and Grandma Eleanor stood before us. But instead of the usual cheerfulness with which she greeted me, her appearance frightened me. She looked smaller, as if she'd shrunk, sitting on her bed surrounded by scattered papers. Her usually neat silvery hair was disheveled, and her face had an unhealthy grayish tint. But when she saw us, she smiled, extended her frail hands, and said softly, "Lisa, Tiffany, thank you for coming." Her voice was weaker than I remembered, which only amplified the worry growing inside me. Mom and I sat down, for once without their usual exchanged glances of annoyance. This silent truce suddenly made me realize how serious things really were. In the corner of the room stood a man, tall and thin, with sharp features. He reminded me of a somber statue, silently observing the scene. It was Mr. Peterson, Grandma's lawyer. He was holding a hefty stack of documents. "I need to discuss something important," Grandma began, her gaze shifting slowly from my mom to me. "I'm not well, and I need to make sure everything is taken care of properly." She paused to catch her breath. The silence felt heavy for some reason. I sat staring at my hands, trying to stay quiet, but my legs swung nervously under the chair. Finally, Grandma continued, "My house and part of my savings will go to your Aunt Linda, Tiffany. But for you, I've planned something special." I looked up and saw Grandma smiling softly at me. I didn't quite understand what she meant, but her intent gaze made me feel a bit awkward. "I'm setting up an education fund for Tiffany," Grandma said, and suddenly her voice gained firmness. "This fund will cover her college expenses when she turns 18. Mr. Peterson will manage all the funds until then." At this, Mom froze. I saw her straighten in her chair, her eyes widen slightly, and her hands, which usually fidgeted with the hem of her dress, suddenly go still on her lap. It seemed as though every word Grandma spoke struck her like a blow. "The money will only be available for educational purposes, and Tiffany will have full control of it once she turns 18, Mr. Peterson added, stepping forward. His voice was formal and slightly detached. Mrs. Eleanor was very specific about her wishes. I perched on the edge of my seat, my legs swinging as I absent-mindedly studied the wallpaper pattern. The whole conversation felt distant and foreign to me. College? It seemed like something from another life. My thoughts were more preoccupied with an upcoming spelling test and whether Jenny Martinez would invite me to her birthday party. Grandma reached out for Mom's hand, and to my surprise, Mom didn't pull away. Her face remained tense, but she listened to every word in silence. "I just want to make sure my granddaughter has opportunities, no matter what," Grandma said, her voice unexpectedly firm. The final sentence hung in the air, laden with an unspoken reproach toward my father. After some paperwork was signed and a few short goodbyes, we headed home. This time, the silence in the car felt different, calmer, almost peaceful. I stole glances at Mom, expecting her to say something or make a remark, but she simply stared ahead, as if deep in thought. When we pulled up to the house, Mom turned to me. Her face had softened, and there was a faint, barely noticeable smile at the corner of her lips. "Well," she said quietly, almost to herself, "it seems like at least one person in your father's family turned out to be decent." The word sounded strange, but I noticed her eyes no longer looked so tired. In that moment, it felt like something in our world had shifted, though I didn't yet understand what. I didn't fully grasp the significance of that day, when Grandma talked about the education fund, until I was much older. At 8 years old, I only knew one thing: Grandma Eleanor had done something kind for me, and this time, Mom wasn't angry. The idea of money for college felt distant and abstract to me. But the caramels Grandma had discreetly slipped into my pocket before we left? Those brought me real joy. But that turned out to be our last visit. Just a few weeks later, Grandma passed away. She slipped away quietly, and her funeral was as modest and understated as she had been. I noticed Mom, usually composed and strict, wiping away tears when she thought no one was looking. She tried to hide her grief, but I saw her red, swollen eyes. With Grandma's passing, the last bridge connecting us to my father's world disappeared. Life went on, as it always does. Over the next 2 years, everything changed. Mom started dating a man named Robert. He seemed like a nice enough person. He had a good job at a bank, drove a sleek black car, and always brought me small gifts, chocolate bars, animal figurines, or books. Mom smiled more often when he was around, and I could hardly remember ever seeing her so calm and happy before. Robert is kind, Mom said one evening over dinner, and with him, I feel safe. I think this is good for us. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy. I was 10 years old, and I dreamed of having a real family, a life like the ones I saw in movies. But the most exciting news was this: Robert had a daughter my age. Her name was Ashley, and she was going to move in with us. You're going to have a sister, Tiffany, Mom said, her smile radiant. Those words lit up my heart with pure joy. I jumped around the room, imagining us sharing secrets, having late-night talks, and playing together. For me, an only child, it was the ultimate dream come true. When the day of their move came, I decorated our shared room, the one Ashley and I would live in together. I hung up colorful welcome signs and neatly arranged my favorite books and toys, ready to share them with her. I wanted her to feel welcome. But reality turned out to be far from what I had imagined. Ashley walked into our room, looked around, and immediately turned to her father. "Can I have my own room?" she asked, as though I didn't exist. "Ashley, sweetheart," Robert began, but she interrupted him. "I don't want to share a room. She's not my sister." Her words were cold and sharp, like a slap. My heart sank. I stood there, still hoping it was some kind of misunderstanding. But it was only the beginning. Ashley quickly took center stage. She would sit next to Mom on the couch during movie nights, pushing me to the edge. Within a week, she started calling my mom Mommy. And every time Mom heard that word, her face lit up with joy. One day, I brought a drawing I'd made at school to show my mom, expecting her to praise me like she used to. "Mom, look at what I drew," I said, holding out the paper. "In a minute, honey," she replied, not taking her eyes off helping Ashley with her homework. That minute never came. Ashley kept talking to Mom about her day, showing her drawings, and asking endless questions. I sat on the sidelines, feeling my excitement fade into bitter disappointment. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. "Mom," I called out. This time, my voice was louder, but it trembled. Mom turned to me. Her gaze was tired, as if I'd done something wrong again. "Tiffany, don't be selfish," she said. "Ashley lost her mom when she was very young. She needs attention and love. You have to understand that." Her words hurt me more than I could have imagined. I wanted to scream, "What about me? Where's my attention? Where's my love?" But instead, I just nodded, barely holding back tears, and went to my room. Ashley's empty bed was a constant reminder that I wasn't good enough. Not good enough for my dad, and now not good enough for my mom. The changes in our family happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. But looking back, I can see how each little moment built a deep chasm between me and Mom. Every conversation, every glance, every word added another brick to the wall I could no longer break through. It started with shopping trips. Mom would come home with bags full of designer clothes for Ashley, trendy jeans, branded sneakers, boutique tops. I silently watched as she carefully laid the purchases out on the couch, admiring each piece. Meanwhile, my clothes were bought on sale at department stores and discount outlets. One day, I couldn't hold back and asked, "Why does Ashley get all new things, and I always get stuff from the sales?" Mom just shrugged and answered in a tone laced with exhaustion. "Ashley needs to keep up a certain image at her new school. Besides, you've never really cared about fashion." I felt the resentment boil inside me, but I didn't argue. Every time I tried to bring it up, the response was always the same. But the real bombshell came during dinner when Robert proudly announced that Ashley had been accepted to Riverside, a prestigious private school across town. Her test scores were exceptional, he said, beaming with pride. She deserves a more challenging academic environment. As I pushed peas around my plate, I felt a tightness in my chest. What about me? I asked, barely keeping the tremor out of my voice. Can I go to Riverside too? Mom and Robert exchanged a glance. That glance told me they had already discussed this behind my back. Mom replied, "Honey, Lincoln High is perfectly fine for you. Ashley is truly gifted and needs a different environment. The regular program suits you better." Those words felt like a verdict. I don't remember how dinner ended. All I remember is burying my face in my pillow that night and crying until there were no tears left. That was the moment something inside me broke. I stopped trying to compete for Mom's attention. I no longer showed her my report cards or told her about my achievements. I knew they didn't matter to her. By the time I was 15, I had completely resigned myself to my place in the family hierarchy. I threw myself into my studies. Not for Mom, not for Robert, for myself. At Lincoln High, I found my niche. I joined the debate team, participated in science fairs, and earned top grades. My teachers praised me. "Exceptional analysis, Tiffany. You have a brilliant future ahead of you." But at home, my successes remained in the shadows. Dinner conversations always revolved around Ashley's accomplishments. Mom would excitedly talk about her participation in a Model UN conference, her advanced placement program placements, and her tennis tournaments. "Ashley's English teacher says she has a talent for writing," Robert added proudly. "And she gets straight A's without even trying." I sat at the table, eating quietly and thinking about how I had won first place at last week's regional science fair. Or how the debate team coach wanted me to lead the team next year. But I kept those thoughts to myself. In their eyes, my achievements at a public school couldn't compare to Ashley's successes at Riverside. Sometimes the resentment surfaced. Like when Mom and Robert attended every one of Ashley's tennis matches but missed my final debate competition. But I had learned to suppress those feelings. I focused on what I could control. I had my goals, my future, and, thanks to Grandma Eleanor, I had a chance to achieve something. Senior year flew by in a whirlwind: college applications, scholarship essays, studying. Mom rarely asked how I was doing, but I kept going anyway. I needed this, not for her, not for Robert, not for anyone else, just for me. As graduation approached, I spent more and more evenings at my desk, surrounded by university brochures and notebooks full of notes. My grades and accomplishments had opened up countless opportunities for me. The most exciting moment came when I learned that I had been awarded a full scholarship to the state university. It was a validation of all my hard work, my discipline, and my persistence. "You don't have to take the scholarship route," my school counselor, Mrs. Martinez, told me one day. "You have your college fund from your grandmother. You can choose any university you dream of: Harvard, Yale. The world is open to you." I shook my head and smiled. "But I don't want to spend that money if I don't have to," I replied. "I'd rather save it for something more important, like a down payment on a house after college." She looked at me thoughtfully and smiled. "You always think ahead, Tiffany. That's impressive." Her words warmed my heart, but I didn't let myself dwell on the praise. There was still a month of work ahead: paperwork, essays, final exams. However, everything changed 2 weeks before my 18th birthday, when Mom unexpectedly called a family meeting. When I walked into the living room, Mom was sitting on the edge of her favorite chair, gripping the armrests nervously. Robert was on the couch, arms crossed over his chest, and Ashley sat next to him, avoiding my gaze. The atmosphere was far too formal. In our family, Conversations like this usually happened over dinner or in passing. Something was clearly wrong. "Take a seat, Tiffany," Mom said, patting the ottoman in front of her. "We need to discuss something important." I obeyed, confused about what was going on. "As you know," Mom began, glancing nervously at Robert and Ashley, "Ashley is graduating this year." I nodded silently. That much was obvious. We were both preparing for graduation. "We've been applying to several universities," she continued, looking over at Ashley. "And Ashley has been accepted to Princeton." "Congratulations," I said flatly, feeling a growing sense of unease in my chest. "But why does this require a meeting?" "The issue is," Robert interjected, leaning forward, "despite her excellent performance at Riverside, her grades weren't quite high enough for a full scholarship." Mom quickly chimed in. "We spent so much on her education at Riverside, and it was worth it. But now, we simply don't have the funds to cover Princeton's tuition." I sat there, staring at their faces, trying to piece together where this was going. Then Mom said the words I would never forget. "We were hoping that, since you have the money from Grandma, you might consider sharing it with Ashley." The words hung in the air. I froze, trying to process what I had just heard. They wanted me to hand over the money that Grandma Eleanor had specifically left for my education to Ashley? The same Ashley who had spent years making it clear that I wasn't her sister? The same Ashley who had everything I could only dream of, while I had always made do with the leftovers? Sharing? I repeated slowly, each word cutting through the air. "You want me to give away the money Grandma left for my education?" "You're getting a full scholarship," Ashley chimed in, as if that explained everything. "You don't even need the money." "We're family, Tiffany," Mom added softly, her voice almost pleading. "And family helps each other." I looked at her. Family? That word hit me like a lightning bolt. Where was this family when I needed support? Where was this family when I felt invisible? "No," I said, the word slipping out before I could stop it. "Absolutely not." "What do you mean?" Mom's voice turned sharp, reminding me of the times she used to push me into agreeing with her decisions. "I mean no," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "That money was left to me by Grandma. It's mine. And I'm going to use it for my future." "Tiffany, you don't understand," Mom began, but I cut her off. "No, Mom. You don't understand. My entire childhood, you put me second to Ashley. All I ever wanted was your love and support, but I was nothing more than a shadow to you. And now, you're asking me to give up the one thing I have left from Grandma?" Robert winced but didn't intervene. Ashley turned away, feigning hurt innocence. "This isn't fair, Tiffany," Mom said, her voice trembling. "You could do this for the family." "Unfair?" I scoffed, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You know what's unfair? Everything that's happened over the past few years. But this money is my future. I'm not letting you take it from me." The room was filled with tense silence. Mom clenched her hands tightly, and I stood up, feeling for the first time in a long while that I had taken control of the situation. Robert's face turned red, and he abruptly turned to Mom. "Do you hear how selfish she sounds? Lisa, this is exactly what I've been saying for years." I couldn't hold back and let out a bitter laugh, loud and cutting through the tense quiet of the room. "Selfish?" I repeated, anger bubbling in my chest. "That's rich coming from you too." "Watch your tone, young lady," Robert snapped, sitting up straight. "You've always been jealous of Ashley, always trying to compete with her, and now you're being spiteful by denying her a chance at a good education." The absurdity of his statement made me laugh again, this time sharply and without joy. "Jealous?" I stood abruptly. "Jealous of what?" "Jealous of how you gave her everything while treating me like an afterthought." And by the way, if she's as brilliant as you claim, why couldn't she earn a scholarship like I did? The words landed like a hammer blow. Ashley's face twisted instantly, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. She jumped up from the couch and ran upstairs, punctuating her exit with the loud slam of her door. "How dare you?" Mom's voice was low but dangerous, like a taut string about to snap. "How dare you be so cruel?" Cruel? I turned to her, my hands trembling with anger. "I'm the cruel one, Mom. You're trying to take away the only thing Grandma left for me. My money. My security. My future." Mom stood, her face as hard as stone. "Then let me make this perfectly clear, Tiffany. You have 2 weeks until your 18th birthday to change your mind. If you don't agree to share the money with Ashley, you'll need to find somewhere else to live." Her words knocked the ground out from under me. I felt the world begin to crumble beneath my feet. You're kicking me out?" My voice shook. "This is my home too." Mom sighed, but her voice remained cold. "No, Tiffany. This house is in my name. In 2 weeks, you'll be 18 and legally an adult. I'm no longer obligated to support you." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My heart felt as though it was being squeezed in a vice. "I don't believe you," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I can't believe you're choosing her over me again." "You're choosing money over family," Robert interjected, his voice sharp. I looked at him, unable to contain my contempt. "Family?" I spat the word. "When have you ever treated me like family?" There was no answer. Mom simply pressed her lips into a thin line. "2 weeks, Tiffany," she said coldly. "Think carefully about your choice." The next few days felt like living in a ghost town where I was the only ghost. No one spoke to me at breakfast. At dinner, my questions were met with tense silence. Ashley looked at me as if I were invisible, and Mom and Robert treated me as though I had overstayed my welcome. I tried to spend as little time at home as possible. Hours dragged on in the library, and evenings were spent alone in my room, eating in silence. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could hear them laughing and talking in the living room. They were happy, a real family of 3. There was no room for a 4th. A few days after that awful family meeting, I made a decision. My hands trembled as I dialed Mr. Peterson's number, my heart pounding in my chest. But his warm, steady voice calmed me. "Tiffany," he said. "I was just thinking about you. Your 18th birthday is coming up soon." "Yes, Mr. Peterson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's exactly why I'm calling." I took a deep breath and blurted everything out, the demand for money, the threat of eviction, the entire farce. Peterson listened silently, without interrupting, and only at the end softly cleared his throat. "I suspected something like this might happen, Tiffany," he said, his voice calm and steady. "That's why I want to reassure you about one thing." I held my breath, bracing myself for his next words. "These funds legally belong to you, Tiffany," Mr. Peterson said in a firm but composed tone. "You'll have full control over them the moment you turn 18. Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes. And frankly, I think she suspected something like this might happen." "What do you mean?" I asked, a shiver running through me. "Let's just say she knew her son's ex-wife very well," he replied after a pause, carefully choosing his words. "Regarding your current living situation, my advice is this: choose a college, preferably in another city, find nearby housing, and I'll help you with the paperwork. You'll have access to the funds on your 18th birthday, but we'll prepare everything in advance." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. His confident tone gave me the strength I desperately needed. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," I said. "I'll get everything ready." That same day, I began researching apartments near the state university, where I'd already been accepted on a full scholarship. By evening, I had found a small but cozy studio apartment 10 minutes from campus. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, agreed to hold it for me until my birthday, when I could make the payment. Every night, after everyone had gone to bed, I quietly packed my things. Photos, books, clothes, my entire childhood condensed into a few cardboard boxes that I hid in the closet. I made sure to move as silently as possible so no one would notice. The process felt both liberating and heartbreaking. On the morning of my 18th birthday, Mom cornered me in the kitchen. She stood with her arms crossed, her gaze cold and demanding. "Well?" she asked. "Have you made your decision?" I looked her straight in the eye and felt a strange calmness wash over me. "Yes," I said. "My decision hasn't changed." "No." Her posture stiffened slightly, but she quickly straightened, as though steeling herself. "Then you know what that means," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a faint hint of uncertainty. "You need to leave this house today." "Fine," I replied, maintaining a composure that seemed to catch her off guard. She had expected tears, please, but instead, I simply went upstairs, gathered the boxes I had already packed, and called the taxi I'd arranged the night before. 20 minutes later, I was unlocking the door to my new apartment. The first thing I did was call Mr. Peterson. He arrived with the paperwork, and by noon, I had access to my grandmother's fund. By 1 p.m., I had paid Mrs. Chen the first month's rent and the security deposit. That same day, I stopped by the local cafe where I had applied for a job the week before. The manager, Mike, smiled when he saw me. "Tiffany, great to see you. Everything's set up. You can start tomorrow." My new apartment was tiny, just one room with a small kitchenette. But it was mine. That evening, I sat on an inflatable mattress, eating takeout and watching the sunset through the single window. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. 2 weeks after I moved out, during a break at the cafe, I was scrolling through Facebook. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Messages from school friends filled my screen. "Have you seen your mom's post? Are you okay? What's going on over there?" With trembling hands, I opened Mom's page. My heart sank as I saw a long, dramatic post. "Ungrateful children break their parents' hearts. My daughter, for whom we've done so much, selfishly refused to help her sister get an education. Instead, she's hoarding her grandmother's money, leaving her sister's dreams behind. I never thought I'd raise such a heartless child." The comments were even worse. "What a terrible situation, Lisa. How could she do that? Ungrateful brat." I stared at the screen, a hot wave of shame and anger rising inside me. People who had no idea what had gone on behind closed doors were judging me. They didn't know how hard I'd fought for a place in this family, how I'd been pushed aside for years. But now, I was the villain in their story. My phone kept buzzing. Another message from a classmate popped up. "I'm here for you. If you need to talk, just let me know." I put my phone down and stared out the window. Anger mixed with pain, but beneath it all, I felt a sense of clarity. Everything they were saying about me wasn't my truth. Relatives I barely knew began weighing in on the situation. Their comments poured in like a tidal wave. How could she be so ungrateful? Family should always come first. What a spoiled brat. I sat in the break room at work, my coffee long gone cold. Anger and pain churned inside me, tightening into a knot I couldn't untangle. I tried to suppress it, but something inside me finally snapped. If my mom had decided to air our dirty laundry on social media, I was ready to share the whole story. I pulled out my laptop, opened my page, and began typing. "Since my mother has decided to make our private family matters public, Let me share my side of the story. Yes, I refused to give my stepsister the money for college that my grandmother specifically left for my education. But what my mother failed to mention is that she gave me an ultimatum: either I give up my inheritance, or I'm kicked out of the house on my 18th birthday. She followed through on that ultimatum. Because of that threat, I was forced to move out, unwilling to hand over the money that is legally mine. For years, I watched as my stepsister received the best of everything: private school tuition, expensive clothes, attention, while I made do with scraps and silence. I worked hard to earn top grades and a full-ride scholarship to college, something I'm incredibly proud of. But apparently, that wasn't enough. They wanted to take my inheritance too. Now, I live on my own, working and preparing for college. But let's be clear, I didn't choose this situation. My mother did, the day she kicked me out on my 18th birthday. I reread the post, my fingers trembling over the post button. I knew I had to do it. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt for responding this way, but my need to defend myself was stronger. I clicked post. The reaction was immediate. By the end of my shift, there were dozens of comments. Among them were words of support from people I hadn't expected to hear from: former teachers, neighbors, even some of my mom's old friends. "Tiffany, I always knew you were strong. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. You deserve the best, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Some shared their observations. People who had known our family for years finally admitted they'd seen the blatant favoritism but had chosen to stay silent. Their words felt like a balm I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, my phone rang. Mom's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Her voice was cold, full of fury. "How dare you? Do you know how humiliating this is? Mrs. Peterson from church won't even look at me. Half my friends have turned their backs on me." "Maybe they should have," I replied calmly, fighting to keep my emotions in check. "You made me out to be a monster." She hissed. "I did everything for you, and this is how you repay me?" I tightened my grip on the phone. "No, Mom," I said. "You did everything for Ashley. And that's fine. She's your daughter now. But I'm done. Goodbye." I hung up, blocked her number, and immediately deleted her from all my social media. While I was at it, I blocked Robert and Ashley too. Surprisingly, it felt easy, as though I had finally shrugged off a weight I'd been carrying for years. Now, I'm in my first semester at the state university, studying business management and building my future. My apartment, though small, grows cozier every day. I've been adding little touches, making it feel like home. Sometimes I think about Mom, Robert, and Ashley, but those thoughts come less and less. I no longer feel pain, just a faint sadness, like looking at an old photograph that's lost its meaning. On my desk sits a photo of Grandma Eleanor. She looks at me with her soft smile, and sometimes I think she knew everything. She must have foreseen that I'd need that money not just for my education but for my freedom. She gave me the chance to choose my own path, and I'll never forget that. Now, I'm living my life. It's not perfect, but it's mine. And for the first time in years, I feel truly happy.